Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever time it may be for you. Welcome back to the Inspiring Leadership Book Club. I'm your intrepid host, Andrew Cohn. This month, we're talking about a book called Humble Inquiry, first published in 2013 by Edgar Schein of MIT, a longtime organization development practitioner, one of the really godfathers of OD. Has inspired one or two generations of followers, just a real iconic guy. Glad you could be with us. We have a small group with us today, and the intention here is we're recording with some open-ended questions with the hopes that you will take this recording, use it, answer those questions, apply this material. There's a lot of interesting material here in this topic to apply. So that's what my hope is that you will watch the recording, have a few questions, and bring them back to your clients, your teams, to yourself. And if you have any questions about how to use this, what would you do? What do you think? Let's talk about it. Feel free to reach out to me. I think my email is on the last slide, and if not, it should be available through the app that got you here. So why don't we, one thing that I'll show you is that this, sorry, just trying to see if the slides will advance. So that's the version of the book that I have. If some of you may have read this book, you'll find a different cover, perhaps even with two names on it, Edgar Schein and Peter Schein. Peter is Ed's son, who works with him now over the last few years. And I think they republished this book a few years after its initial publication date to get Peter into the loop a bit. The younger generation, some new energy. And I've seen the two of them speak about this too. There's a couple of YouTube talks you can find where they're talking about this. So this book is called Humble Inquiry, The Gentle Art of Asking Instead of Telling. There's no mystery in what the book is about and what the title's about. And what I'd like to do is talk about four key themes here. What is humble inquiry? What does it look like or sound like, real specifically? Some of you may know I'm a recovering lawyer. I didn't grow up as a coach or an HR or anything like that. And I tend to, as a practitioner, what are we talking about here specifically? So what does it look like? What does it sound like? What are we talking about? What gets in the way of humble inquiry? And there's some different dimensions of that, both cultural, organizational, relational or structure, rank, hierarchy, and then some internal barriers we may have as well. And we'll talk about each of those subheadings. And then what Schein calls developing the humble inquiry attitude, just having a mindset that invites us into this, this way of communicating and the benefits of it. Okay, so the definition he uses a few times in the book, actually, humble inquiry is the skill in the art of drawing someone out and asking questions to which you do not already know the answer. So think about that's already a different kind of inquiry. It's not a rhetorical question, or of building a relationship based on curiosity and interest in the other person. So humble inquiry is relational. It is not inquiry into the answer to a technical question or a process question. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And ultimately, the purpose of humble inquiry is to build relationships that lead to trust, which leads to better communication and collaboration, and as he talks about, and results. So yes, it's about building relationships, but it's about building relationships in the context of something greater, whether it's a relationship with a doctor in an oncology treatment situation, or a relationship with a subordinate team member, a relationship between somebody who's in the cockpit on the flight crew. But it's the relationship and the context as well, which is very important. So this is a guy who's at MIT and is in organization development, and he works in the business sector primarily. So we're talking about something to be used in the workplace, although not exclusively. So we could talk about that. So what does it look like and sound like? So the second chapter of the book is case examples. So let me share a couple of examples here and go back to this. We'll talk about what is it, some specific examples. So for example, he tells the story, I'm just referring to some dimensions of the book here, that's why I'm looking down. He tells the story of somebody stopping him on the street when he was walking his dog in the Boston area And somebody said, how do I get to Massachusetts Avenue in Boston? And he said that he responded to her by asking, where are you trying to get to? And he said he asked that question because he could have directed her to where she asked to go. But in fact, she said she was trying to get to downtown Boston, and he directed her to get to downtown Boston, not to Massachusetts Avenue, which was what she was asking him. So the dimension of humble inquiry that he was illustrating here is, I want to understand what this person's purpose is and where they're going, because that'll help me respond to their question in a better way. So again, drawing someone out, asking questions that I don't know the answer to, building relationship interest in the other person, and in this case, to provide more effective collaboration and give her the answer. So he said she was already on the direct road to Boston, so I just told her to keep going on the road she was on. And he says, to this day, I wonder what would happen if I would have told her how to get to Massachusetts Avenue, because that would not have been helpful for her. So the example of humble inquiry in that sense is inquiring of her what her interests were, as opposed to answering her question. It's interesting, I think. He shares another example of he was launching a new task force in an organization, and an environmental organization that was launching a capital fundraising campaign. And the executive director asked him to help her chair a task force to do some pre-work about, are we ready to join another, launch another capital campaign? And his colleague, or the executive director, said, at the beginning of the meeting, we should talk about what were the mistakes we made last time, so that we can try to anticipate those mistakes and head them off this time. And he said, okay, we had two options. We could tell the group what the previous mistakes were, so we avoid going in the wrong direction, okay? Or he said we could ask more open questions. And the question that he asked was, why does each one of you belong in this organization in the first place? Right? Changing the tone of the conversation from focusing on what were the mistakes previously made, which very well-intentioned, we don't want to make those mistakes again. Let's talk about those mistakes. Let's learn from those mistakes. His inquiry was why do you want to be in this room having this conversation, contributing to this issue? And what he said was, they took the time with no interruptions or questions or comments until they went all the way around the table. And as a result, they had a very positive and enthusiastic conversation about what they wanted to bring, why they were participating in this way, contributing their energy to the organization. Yes, they still, and what his point was, we still had the conversation about what mistakes did we make last time, but it wasn't the framework for the conversation. It wasn't what the conversation was about. So to back off, that's a humble inquiry piece, to back off and to ask people, why are you here? Tell me what's drawing you here. I mean, obviously, that's a question I don't know the answer to with respect to each of your individual interests. But by doing that, it draws people's energy into the room. We can circle back and talk about what the history has been. But let's not frame the conversation in terms of the unproductive history. Let's frame the conversation in terms of the energy that each of you is bringing. That's another example he shares about what humble inquiry is. A couple more to share. I think it's useful to share these things because it brings it to life a little bit. He said he said, I arrived in Cambridge with my new bride. He had just been married, and he's in Cambridge, and he's working on his first book. Or actually, excuse me, he's grading papers for some first-year MBA students. It was before the book, I think. And his wife knocked on the door several times, asking if he would take a break and maybe take her out for a cup of tea. And he kept saying he couldn't do it. He had to finish the lecture. He had to finish grading papers. Going for tea would have been a total disruption. And he said, well, at the time, he said, looking back, I realized I had three options. One is to do what he had done and continue to stick to his guns and say, sorry, I can't do it. I'm working on this. The second is to give in and take her out to tea. So if he'd done the first one, he said, I would have sent the message that my work is more important than she was. I would have missed possibly the opportunity to speak about something that was important to her. I never had the opportunity. If I just say to her, I'm not available, please don't interrupt. He said I would feel guilty and ashamed in how he responded, because he felt it was really closing the door to a very important relationship. And then the second option, taking her out to tea, and basically he said giving in and abandoning his plan. He said, well, one downside of that is that I could go out with her, but I wouldn't really be there because I'd be distracted by the work I still needed to do. I may have to work late into the night, which is going to create new problems. I might resent the fact that I'm with her, and that causes problems and tension in the relationship. He didn't like those two options. And the third option, as he looked back on it, was what he called an example of humble inquiry, being empathetic, sitting down with her to talk about what was on her mind, giving her his full attention for a period of time, and suggesting that they talk for just a minute. So this, I think, is a great example that he gives about what a humble inquiry option would be. Find out what's important to her, take a minute. And by doing that, he can see if there really is anything very important that she needs to talk about or needs help. He can show his prioritizing the relationship. Doesn't have to abandon what he's doing because he's only taking a minute. And he comes with a few questions for her as opposed to telling her why he's not available. I think that was another excellent example that he brings to life here. I think there's one more that I wanted to share. Bear with me while I check my notes here. Right. Something he talks about at the beginning of the book. It's a great example of this notion of humble inquiry in action. And I like these examples because it gets below the label and brings it to life. He said, one of my executive students in the MIT Sloan program was studying for some final exams, very important final exam. He was down in his basement study, and he had specifically told his 6-year-old not to interrupt him when he goes downstairs and studies and closes the door, not to interrupt him. That's his focus time. And after a little bit of time, he heard a knock on the door, and his daughter, he knew that it was she, and he said, I thought I told you not to interrupt me. And she burst off in tears. And he felt bad at what had happened, but he also thought, well, I told her, please don't interrupt. It's very important that I have the space for my studying. He said the next morning, his wife berated him for upsetting their daughter. And he said, I defended myself vigorously. And then he said, my wife interrupted and said, I sent her down to you to say goodnight and ask you if you wanted a cup of tea or a cup of coffee to help with your study. Why did you yell at her instead of ask her why she was there? Asking her why she was there is humble inquiry, as opposed to responding with a boundary or a reaction based on ignorance, not stupidity, but ignorance. He didn't know why she was there. And how sweet it would have been for her to have that opportunity to offer her dad this cup of coffee. And that's what happened because he was focused in a particular way and didn't ask the open, humble inquiry question. So that's another example. So I wanted to take some time to talk about those examples before we get into some more descriptors of this. Okay, let's talk some more. Okay, so what does it look like and sound like? So it looks like, let me make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself here. Yeah, so he talks about in chapter 3, differentiating humble inquiry from other forms of inquiry. He talks about diagnostic inquiry, confrontational inquiry, and process inquiry that are very different. I'm going to take this off so you're not looking entirely at the screen. So diagnostic inquiry would be, not surprisingly, asking questions to diagnose a situation. So you're asking a further question instead of answering an original question that someone may have. To ask diagnostic inquiry questions is to take charge of the conversation, to solve a problem, right? So basically you're steering a conversation to satisfy, I'm steering a conversation to satisfy my curiosity. What's going to solve this problem? I'm asking diagnostic questions. It's very different than a question that's going to build a relationship. It's a question that's going to solve a problem, or may not solve a problem, especially if I'm pursuing a line of questioning, like we lawyers do, but it's not going to necessarily develop the relationship in any meaningful way. And by asking a leading or focused question, it's different than humble inquiry in the sense that it's not going to invite really the input or the creativity of the person who might be responding to the question. So he says, for example, be aware of several categories of questions that might tip you off that the questions are more about your curiosity than about inquiring humbly. For example, asking about feelings and reactions, causes and motives, right? And action steps. So these are really good questions to ask, like what's behind that? What did someone mean? What did you mean? What actions can we take? Systematic questions or systemic questions, excuse me, that build understanding of the whole situation and context could be really useful. Different than humble inquiry. Different than humble inquiry. As are what he calls confrontational questions. So for example, did that make you angry? Is somewhat of a confrontational question versus how did that make you feel? Or related to causes and motives, do you think that they were sitting that way because they were scared, as opposed to why do you think they were sitting that way? So different ways to ask questions to stay out of something that put somebody on the defensive, but rather getting a more open-ended question. And again, something that's more likely to build the relationship. So to ask questions about actions or being action-oriented, like, why didn't you say something to the group? Good specific question, but it's not going to be an open question like, what did you do? Or what was your thinking behind what you did? Right? So it's different. It's very different. And I'm making these distinctions just in terms of the tone of these questions, because it could be helpful to understand what his model is. As he says, shifting the conversational focus is really key, and making sure that the conversational focus is on the other person and learning from the other person, something we didn't already know. It's very different than being a diagnostician, or certainly asking something confrontational. So some tips for what it looks like, sounds like. Minimizing our own preconceptions is quite important. Clearing our head at the beginning, excuse me, that's a typo, at the beginning of the conversation. So being ready to inquire. So leaving the previous meeting behind, which is something I talk about often in coaching work. So to be really present, so clear our heads, because it's really only then that I can listen. We'll get to that in a second. So maximize our listening as the conversation proceeds. So that's what it looks like, that what we're looking is to really maximize or optimize the listening as the conversation happens. So I'm not driving an agenda here, unless the agenda is to learn more about this person and to develop the relationship. Ultimately, that's the agenda for humble inquiry. And here, a very important point, the most important diagnostic that the other person will use to decide if you're interested, it's not what you ask, but how you hear the response. Are you really hearing the other person? That's really, really important in terms of what does it look like and what does it sound like? It sounds like and feels like the person is being heard. Very, very important on this in this context. So what gets in the way? There's several chapters about this in the book. He talks first about the culture of do and tell. He focuses on US culture in this chapter, although there's other discussions in the book about cultural differences between people that might impact relationship building questions and answers, which is obviously very important. But he talks specifically in chapter 4 about US culture and as compared to some other cultures as well. And he refers to our culture in the US as the culture of do and tell. He says the main inhibitor of humble inquiry is the culture in which we grew up. The more authoritarian the culture, the greater the sociological distance between the upper and lower levels of status or achievement, right? That's one dimension of cultural difference, as we know from other models. And the harder it is for the superior to be humble and learn the art of humble inquiry. So culture in general, one dimension of culture is level of authoritarianism or differences in status. And the stronger the status difference element of the culture, for example, places like Spain, Japan, the harder it is for someone to practice humble inquiry. The leader is less likely to be humble because I'm the leader and I have status. I don't think to be vulnerable and ask a question I don't know the answer to. And then the subordinate is less likely to participate in that conversation openly because it's not my role to be, or appropriate even, to be open with the person of higher authority. So in the United States, we have a culture that values task accomplishment more than relationship building. I don't know if you'd agree with that. I probably would agree with that. If we were sitting and speaking about this, I'd be curious to know what your response would be. Would you agree that the US culture values task accomplishment more than relationship building? Generally, and even in the workplace? Do we reward people for building relationships, or do we just reward people for getting stuff done? In the United States, status and prestige are gained by task accomplishment. And once you're above somebody else, you're licensed to tell them what to do. I think there's some truth to that. Once you're in a senior position, it's almost like you're being expected to tell people what to do. That's what they want from you. Would you agree? I think that's an interesting question, as that's a cultural norm. And he said the second problem we have in the US is that we live in a culture of tell. To ask something is to reveal ignorance or potential, not stupidity, but to reveal ignorance and weakness. I'm asking you something, that means I need something from you. It might mean I don't know the answer. And we ask questions like that, of course, from time to time, but in the workplace, it's a little tougher because every time we ask a question that we don't know the answer to, we're saying, I'm vulnerable. There's something that I don't know. Knowing things is highly valued, and telling people what we know is almost automatic. That's what we tend to do in the workplace. In the coaching world, where that's like beaten out of us. Don't tell people what to do and don't tell them what to know. Don't tell them what you know. Ask questions. That's how we're trained. That's what we do. And in most situations in other professions, and even what we do when we're not coaching people, is we drop into tell, because that is, I believe, a cultural norm, certainly in the workplace in this country. So the important question is, why is this important now? Why are we talking about this? Why are we taking on US culture and challenging it in terms of its effectiveness? And he said, well, the changing nature of tasks. So as he describes it, the world's becoming more technologically complex, interdependent, and culturally diverse. Fair. Which makes the building of relationships more necessary to get things accomplished, because we're working across technologies, across functions, across cultures, across generations as well, I would add. And at the same time, so it's more necessary to work across those differences. And at the same time, it becomes more difficult because of the complexity of these differences. So through humble inquiry, teams can build upon the initial relationships. They can and develop initial relationships that help them learn together. And as they build higher levels of trust through learning together, they become more open in their communication, which helps them become better able to deal with the inevitable surprises that arise in complex interdependent situations. So he talks about air flight crews that have checklists, and it's great to have a checklist, but checklists don't anticipate problems that might happen. If there is a status difference within a culture or within a team that prevents a lower level, a subordinate, from speaking up. So for example, the studies that were done, and he refers to this somewhat superficially, but this has been researched more in many other places, including Malcolm Gladwell spends a chunk of time talking about the plane crash situations and how people don't speak up when there's status differences because they don't feel like it's appropriate to challenge the pilot or challenge the first officer who's in a higher position. And as a result of that, that cultural norm that prevents someone from speaking up, the plane crashes. Shine maintains that humble inquiry can help bridge some of those gaps. If the leader or the person with status can inquire humbly and invite people, give me feedback, tell me what's happening, what do you think? These types of things could be avoided, and God willing, they will be. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the impact of culture on open inquiry and open conversation and relationship building. As he says, if bosses don't build relationships with their subordinates, they won't be able to judge whether communication is good. So if I don't have a relationship with you, I don't even know if our relationship is good, if our communication is good, because we're not communicating, right? In many situations, subordinates won't admit that they don't understand something. They may even withhold information, even safety information, because they may have competing priorities. How do we know that if we're not having an open conversation? Do we share the same superordinate goal, as he calls it? Do we share the same ultimate goal? For example, safety, timeliness, schedule. Are we even motivated by the same things? We can recognize we're not motivated by the same things, but that we have the same shared performance goal. These things are surfaced through humble inquiry. That's what the book talks about. I think it's quite interesting. Yeah, he said sometimes a boss might announce that our shared goal is one of safety. Safety is the most important superordinate goal. That's what we're really going for. But sometimes unwittingly send signals that cost or speed is just as important or even more important, right? So in other words, the policy could be that safety is our number one thing. And that could be what I say from the front of the room. But if what you get from my behavior is that speed and cost savings is at least as important, that can be very costly. How is that discussed? How do we talk about that if there are status differences among our team and people are not openly speaking up? If surgeons have not built relationships with their teams, team members may withhold information and even jeopardize patient safety because they don't feel psychologically safe to speak up to challenge the almighty surgeon. And I actually have some surgeon friends, not too many, some surgeon friends who've talked about this. It's like we need to be more open and be able to communicate with the anesthesiologists, the nurses at different levels, the medical technicians. They may see something that I'm not seeing. Shine is talking about in this book, among other things, how humble inquiry opens the door to this communication and relationship building, bridges those status differences so that together, not only can we get a better shared result, better shared performance, performance is recognized, individual contributions, et cetera. Basically, the whole system is better off if we can use this tool to develop relationships. I think it's quite interesting that way. As he says, subordinates are almost always in a vulnerable position and must first be reassured before they fully commit to open communication and collaboration, right? If I don't feel safe to speak up to my boss, even if she or he said, oh, no, really, give me feedback, I'm paying attention to the cues as well. And if the cues don't demonstrate openness, I'm going to keep something to myself, And at best, it could be, okay, it's just a piece of information. Not everybody needs to know something. At worst, I know something that's going to prevent this plane from crashing or this patient from dying, God forbid, or something like that. So this is a tool to bridge those gaps, and culture gets in the way. Another thing that gets in the way is status, rank, and role boundaries, right? Which is what we always talking about in terms of culture, and also in terms of some of the medical professionals, flight crews. He says, we have very clear expectations about what is the appropriate demeanor for a high status person. We also have clear rules about how lower status people should demonstrate deference to the higher status person, right? These things can get in the way of working effectively as a team, of course. And he said, very, very importantly here, these rules and expectations vary widely depending upon the culture, right? The national culture is what I'm talking about. So it's something to pay attention to. I'm not going to go into all those differences now, but something to pay attention to. And he talks about personalization. Personalization is the process of acknowledging the other person as a whole human, not just a role. So I'm speaking with you as Dr. So-and-so, not just the anesthesiologist who is subordinate to me, the surgeon. But personalization is so, so important. So in our communication that we're speaking to people as people, not just as roles. This may sound obvious, but in particular in certain functions, professions, teams, he's talking about power plant safety, pilots, certainly the military. And the military, from what I've read, has done great work to break down some of these barriers to enable people of lower rank to speak up and challenge people of higher authority in terms of the task so that we're all better off, and certainly lives are at stake. So He cites some research done by Amy Edmondson at Harvard about cardiac surgery teams. The teams that were most able to adapt and utilize more complex procedures, so arguably the higher performing teams, the one that could work on more complex procedures, had made special efforts to learn together as a team and reduce status differences by learning together as a team, and even eating together in the cafeteria. So teams of surgical teams with different people of different status, different levels, were eating together at the same table in the cafeteria, which is unusual behavior in that culture where the techs eat together, the anesthesiologists eat together. Must be an interesting conversation. The surgeons eat together. We stick with our people. Well, but the team could do better if our people are our team, and it's more open and more communication. So some research plays that out. So that's, again, something else that gets in the way, the status, rank, and role boundaries, and how we need to, personalization is the key. And also forces inside of us. So what's happening inside myself, and what he talks about is, in what ways do we either hold back? In what ways do we have blind spots that get in the way of more open communication? In what ways might we feel unsafe or afraid to ask a question that makes us vulnerable? These are all things that are all happening inside of me that may impact the questions that I may or may not choose to ask. He talks about the Joe Harry window that many of us are familiar with, that is a model for recognizing what other people see and what we might see about our own behavior and our own preferences and where we might have blind spots. And then he talks about this cycle of observe, react, judgments, and intervention, or ORJI. Interesting acronym, actually, ORJI. ORJA, ORJI, why don't I call it that to make it a little bit more G-rated? So he says, the way we observe is critically important. If we can observe with some neutrality and clarity, then what we say and how we say it is more likely to be accurate and appropriate than if our observation is clouded by something. So regarding observation, the key is to understand and attempt to reduce any initial distortions in our perceptions, and limiting bias is also very important, right? So what gets in the way of humble inquiry sometimes could be what my bias would be. Anything that's going to interfere with a clear observation on my part. So in terms of reaction, so he says we observe, we react, we make a decision at some point, and then we take action. So the observation needs to be clear. Regarding reaction, the most difficult aspect, as he says, is that we often don't even realize that we're reacting. We think we're making a reasoned response, but in fact, we're reacting. And we're reacting because something pushes our buttons, or we're triggered by something that can happen. He said one way to diffuse the dangerous reactivity that sometimes happens, especially when we don't think it's reactivity, is to take the step to ask ourselves, what am I feeling right now? Because if we check in on the feeling level, it's a way of intervening to minimize the chances of reaction. What we really want to do is respond. And regarding judgment, to keep our judgment clear, he said the most important thing is to recognize that our capacity to reason is limited, and it's really based on the data on which we're relying to make a decision and to make a judgment. And humble inquiry is a way to harvest good data. So be aware of making judgments that are founded on data that may be incomplete or perhaps driven by my agenda as opposed to someone else's agenda that might be really enhancing and important in terms of making a better judgment and making a better decision. So again, bad judgment can get in the way and be an inhibitor of humble inquiry. And then regarding intervention, the opportunity is not to act impulsively, but again, to reflect. And we'll talk about some in the next chapter and final chapter, chapter 7, what are some things that we can do to stay on the positive side of this cycle of observe, react, judgments, and intervention, or ORJI. He said the time when humble inquiry is often most needed is when we observe something that makes us angry or anxious. We then need to slow down. We need to ask others in a humble way so that we can check out the facts. So think about that. Something happens, I'm in reaction, I get triggered, some other thing, and I'm asking for more information. How am I asking for that information? Am I angrily snapping at someone? Or am I asking something that's open, that really invites input? And think about the difference in response that I'm going to get in response to those two behaviors. Yeah, and this is another statement that I highlighted here, another quote. The reason that asking is a strength rather than a weakness. So for most of us, and most of the time, I'm claiming this too, if we're asking for something we don't know the answer, it makes us vulnerable. The reason that it's a strength rather than a weakness is that it provides a better chance of figuring out what's actually going on. So if we can get past our limitation, whether that's self-imposed or culturally appropriate or role-based, we have a better chance of figuring out what's going on. So are we willing to counter some of these forces that get in the way in order to get a better result for ourselves, for each other, and for our organization, team, or whatever that shared goal is. So finally, whoops, hold on. I'm not there yet. Yes, so developing the humble inquiry attitude. It's a bunch of bullets on this page, forgive me, but some really useful things here. Developing the attitude. So first, he talks about learning anxiety. So learning anxiety is a barrier to learning, right? If we're anxious about learning, then that's going to be a barrier for us to learn. So what can we do to decrease learning anxiety? So what can we do to level the playing field in terms of our conversations, level the playing field in terms of our status, and open up these conversations? Anything that we can do to reduce anxiety around learning. So when teams are coming together to ask questions, the context of that conversation is important. The timing of that conversation is important. Who's in the room is important. Maybe there's somebody who comes into the room to help facilitate that conversation, to reduce the level of anxiety around learning, so we can be more open and vulnerable about what we don't know. That's part of the humble inquiry attitude in chapter 7. The second thing he highlights is slow down and vary the pace, right? He said, learning humble inquiry is not learning how to run faster, but learning how to slow down in order to make sure that I have observed carefully and I've taken full stock of the situational reality, right? Only when things have slowed down a bit. I mean, it's really obvious, and yet we often don't do it, right? If we're zooming by something at 100 miles an hour, how clearly are we going to see it? Slow down, take the whole picture in. Humble inquiry is one tool for getting the whole picture. So slowing down, and as he says, varying the pace is important. Or it's interesting the way he puts it. I've often talked with my clients about we slow down. We can't align at high speed. We need to slow down in order to align. Once we're aligned, we can go fast. And that's what he's talking about when he says the learning stage where relationship is being built requires slowing down and building trust. So it takes time to get to know our peers, our colleagues, people on our team. Are you willing to devote the time in a meeting to slow down and have people get to know each other, knowing that, as he says, once the relationship has been built, work actually gets done much faster because we're aligned. I think that's a great. So vary the pace is slow down to align, then we can move faster. Another dimension of developing the attitude, as he calls it, is reflecting more and asking ourselves humble inquiry questions. So he says, so reflecting more is assessing what's the nature of the situation we're in. What does the situation require? Be more reflective that way. Understanding what's the present state of our relationships with others. What's really happening here? That's what he's talking about in reflect more. And most importantly, what's going on in our own heads? As he says, to apply humble inquiry to ourselves is really what we're going after. So reflecting more and asking ourselves some of these questions is also part of the attitude, as he calls it. Becoming more mindful. He refers to a mindfulness teacher whom he knows that asked him a very powerful question. as he was describing a situation and a conclusion that he reached about what was happening, she said to him, "What else was happening at that time?" He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, you're telling me what your conclusion was. Chances are, as with most of us, we will rush to a conclusion because we're action oriented. We're do and tell culture, especially in the US. Maybe not especially, but certainly here. But what else was happening at the same time? What else is happening?" It's a great question in terms of becoming more mindful and paying attention to the details. What else is being said? What's happening with the other people in the room? What's the body language? Is there anything I'm missing? Is a good humble inquiry question. Be more mindful. He says, try innovating and engage the artist within you. There's a number of pieces there, steps we can take, ways to express our more creative side is a way of getting out of our heads, our preconceptions, and being more open. So art and creativity opens us up. He talks about that. Review and reflect upon our own behavior after an event is something else we can do. We develop that habit. So this is, as he called the power of a process review, right? Humble inquiry is the primary form of question in an after action review or in any type of process review that is encouraging everyone at the table to speak frankly about what happened. If you think about it, what good is an after action review if people aren't comfortable speaking up? And humble inquiry makes it safer and easier for people to speak up. Be sensitive to coordination needs in your work. So as he says, we can use humble inquiry to determine the state of interdependence, like how interdependent are we? What are the processes that we might put in place to help encourage and promote humble inquiry? So by being sensitive to coordination needs, we could pay attention to where is better and more coordination necessary so that we can facilitate greater levels of humble inquiry in our work. He says, as a leader, build relationships with team members. Hello, it's pretty obvious. And he says, I think this is simple, but really powerful. The toughest relearning or new learning is for leaders to discover their dependence on their subordinates. Leaders are really dependent on their subordinates. I don't know what everybody's job is. I don't know what motivates them. I don't know where the tension points are. I don't know what they need in order to work most effectively. I'm dependent on them to share that with me so that even if I control all the resources in the organization, by the way, this is a fantasy world that I'm describing right now, but even if I have all those resources, do I even know if the relationships aren't solid enough? Very, very important. And that requires a level of vulnerability on the part of the leader. That's a lot of what this is about, this book. And he calls cultural islands. These are the places where, as a team, we can attempt to share some of the cultural rules and norms relating to authority and trust relationships. So he talks about how there's an opportunity for us to create subcultures within our teams that might even be inconsistent or even contrary to what a national or functional or status-based roles and boundaries, et cetera, might otherwise impose. So we could say, yeah, I get that ordinarily we wouldn't speak this openly with each other, but on this team, in this surgical room, in this cockpit, in this nuclear power plant, wherever it might be, we need to level with each other. And therefore, how can we build our own culture, what he calls a cultural island? That's an opportunity too for leaders really at all levels in organizations. So the discussion themes I would invite you to consider are, which dimensions of this conversation or which themes here are most relevant for you and or your clients at this time? So let's talk about with each other, with our clients, what is happening in terms of levels of interdependence. Are we really more dependent on one another now because of greater because of technology communicating with technology? We like to think that it's taking the people out of the equation, but it's not, because people are driving that technology. Working across functions, working across cultures, working across generations, which is one important dimension of culture. What's most relevant for us to be talking about at this time? The need for deeper relationships, not simply being transactional, not communicating with people just as their function, but personalizing a bit more. That's, I think, an important topic. Leaders needing to demonstrate vulnerability, expressing what we don't know, asking for input, and also this notion of increased self-awareness. How can I hold a mirror up to myself so that I'm present, mindful, reflective, trying to keep my screen clear so that my observations are accurate, so I could take accurate action. I think these are all very important themes. What do you think? What would you want to share with your teams about this? Second question, what would you like to pay more attention to with regard to that? Where might you want to focus? And then question 3, what are the next steps with this material? You might choose to, this is a little book. It's a fairly quick read. You might choose to buy a copy of it with your team. You might choose to share one of you might choose to share this talk. You might choose to share one of his YouTube talks. He's spoken at various conferences, sometimes Professor Shine alone, or sometimes with his son as well. What might be the next step? Would that be useful to bring in that voice, the voice of the book or the voice of the author, to a conversation, and how would that be helpful? So I invite you to think about this content, use this content. I think it's quite interesting. I've shared this book with several clients, including a very high-level IT leader in an organization who had gotten some feedback that he ran very, very fast. He didn't connect well with subordinates. He needed to understand people more, do more asking rather than telling. I recommended this book, and it really changed his team dynamics around, particularly with his peers, that he was suddenly his peers were feeling more valued as a result of some of these new behaviors. And he was just asking and open. His intention was not being reflected in his behavior. And this book helped him understand how these differences in status and cultural differences, because he was working across national cultures as well, how that was getting in the way. It could be a really good resource for you, for your teams. So I invite you to think about it, use it. And if there's anything that I can do or anybody on our team can do, please let me know. I welcome the conversation. So we will see you next month in January of 2022, where we have a very interesting and unusual book to discuss with you, where we're going to bring in the author and I will interview her. I'm not going to tell you what that is because perhaps you're watching this 3 or 4 months from now, and it could be out of sequence, but I look forward to seeing you and hearing from you in 2022.